HOA Storytime, tenant handles a Karen neighbor in a very creative and funny way. So, unfortunately, one of my rentals shares the same courtyard as this old Karen, who, for the lack of better description, has nothing better to do but to be the community mall cop and to report people who violate every HOA rule to the board. It's obvious that she's been there for a long time as the original owner, and she hates the tenants and investors, and uses her free time to try and annoy and pester anyone in the community that is not owner-occupied. My tenants are a couple, professional with a toddler, very respectful, and just all-out good people. So, a few months ago, I start getting an inch of HOA violation notices for the stupidest crap. I get one because they left their baby stroller outside in the private patio. HOA rules say that private patio is not supposed to be used as a place of storage. And then, another HOA notice about leaving a shoe rack outside of their doorstep, and another notice about leaving an Amazon open box on the patio. It is annoying as heck, and every single time my immigrant tenants apologize, and I'm like, what the heck are you apologizing for? You didn't do anything wrong. Some butthole is being petty. So every single time I go to the HOA board meeting, and then I argue these stupid write-ups, I'm like, hey, what the heck? I point out a dozen or so other units, they have a lot more crap on their patio, and they don't get violations, and then threaten to sue the board for selective enforcement of HOA rules, discrimination, and financial damage to me from the constant harassment. They usually back off then and say, never mind. So one day, I get a call from them, and they say that this old lady neighbor was there, complaining to them about how they left some beach towels and a wetsuit outside on a temporary drying rack to dry, and they can't use the patio for that. Holy crap, she's been the one that's been complaining all this time. So I go over there, thinking just the worst, thinking that my tenant has this huge old 6-foot tall drying rack hanging similar to the one that I have at home, and putting out their underwear on it, only to see, when I get there, there's like a 2-foot tall drying rack that's lower than the retaining wall of the patio that you can't even see unless you're literally within 5 feet from the patio peeking over. I was thinking, you gotta be kidding me, really? So I'm talking to this old lady that has nothing better to do. I'm like, look, Karen, you can't even see anything from your patio. The only way you can see this is if you're within 5 feet. Just go around and don't bother them and we won't bother you, okay? But no, she has to make her point, which is be an HOA rule jerk, and report both me and the tenant to the HOA board. And so I'm like, just fine, you do that, lady. So I go home, I'm just fuming that this old lady is wasting my time and my tenant's time on stupid crap. I find my 6-foot tall laundry rack, I drop it off at my tenant's place, and I set it up in the backyard patio and tell him, please, air dry all of your clothes for the next week, especially underwear. And if this lady reports it, let her. Screw her. Here's a Starbucks gift card for your inconvenience of not using the dryer. Reluctantly they did, and yes, I got written up twice for the same thing, which means that it included a $200 fine. So I go to the HOA board meeting. The Karen lady is there complaining about how my tenants hung clothes outside 2 times now, despite getting a warning. When the board asked me, I said, yeah, that's correct. And it's their legal right to do that in this state. Confused, the board asked me, what do I mean? And I told them, well, in this state, thanks to AB 1448, CVC 1940.20, and 4750.10, also known as the Right to Dry Law, an HOA cannot legally ban hanging laundry outside, nor can they have them any rules that prevent tenants or owners from hanging laundry outside. No different than legally an HOA cannot outright ban anyone from putting a satellite dish outside. The HOA can impose rules governing how drying racks or satellite dishes can be placed. For example, rules stating that such things cannot be permanently attached to common area or building structure, but they cannot outright ban them, and those rules specifically have to describe the details of those restrictions in order to be enforceable. Your HOA rules governing laundry, clothes, and so on predates AB 1448, which was created for energy conservation by encouraging people not to run a dryer, and has no details on the restrictions of when temporary drying racks can or can't be used. So your rule violates state's laws, and it's not enforceable. My tenant only needs permission to use drying racks, and they have my permission, please note. Talk to your attorneys, because I already talked to mine. The HOA board concludes with a, we'll get back to you, Mr. X. and I don't hear about it for a few days. And then, finally, I get a call that says, "Our attorneys reviewed your complaint, and in a nutshell, as long as the drying racks are not being permanently attached, state law says that you can have an outdoor drying rack." So, after I got that from the HOA board, was I being a vindictive butt when I gave my tenants a Starbucks gift card while asking them for a favor to hang some underwear on a 6-foot tall drying rack outside for 2 months to crap on the Karen neighbor? Also, was I a bigger butt when Karen contacted me to complain further, and I told her, "Well, if it bothers you so much, you can get one of those patio wind shades to block your view so you don't see my tenants' underwear. But if you do that, and if I see it when I'm checking up on my property, I'm going to have to report you to the HOA because, unfortunately, patio wind shades are not a state law protected class of apparatus from the HOA rules, which clearly bans these wind shades. Have a nice day." This is a perfect example, as our friend Rick Astley says, "You know the rules, and so do I." What would you do? Boss didn't pay me, so I started a company out of spite to put him out of business, posted by a deleted account. The year was 2008, and I was 9 years into operating a landscape company. I had done moderately well for myself, being able to purchase a home, pay off student loans, and start a family. I employed 4 people during what I call the work season, which for us is March through November. December through February, we lay off our workers and go on hiatus for the most part. Side note, our company is focused mainly on maintenance and in the Pacific Northwest. Once all the leaves are picked up from the autumn, there really isn't much maintenance to be done. I had, that year, developed a relationship with a home builder who hired me to care for his personal home and very much liked our work. He asked us to start bidding on installing the landscapes to the homes he built. Sounds easy, right? Well, remember, we focused mainly on maintenance, so my crew didn't have a ton of experience in the install detail of landscape, and the homes this guy built were not track homes or your cookie cutter type neighbors you find in the suburbs. No, a small home for him was 3,500 square feet on a 25,000 square foot lot, and an average size he developed was 8,500 to 10,000 square feet home with all the bells and whistles. He was more generous in his landscape budgets than many of the contractors I'd met, and we were off to what I'd hoped would be a great partnership. We finished the first 4 projects he handed us, and it was now the beginning of December when my maintenance side of things drops off. This home builder came to me and asked if I would like to keep my maintenance crew working for the winter for him. I knew his next home project wasn't set to break ground till late January, so I asked what he had in mind. He told me that he and his son had been experimenting with spray foam insulation in their homes and had decided to invest into purchasing equipment to start their own company. To purchase equipment on this level was about $100,000. I said I would talk to the crew and get back with him. The next week, we signed a contract to work with him for 3 months at a specified pay rate for 5 of us. He was confident he had enough work to keep us busy for the next 3 months. First job was insulating this incredible house for this plastic surgeon who spared no expense for the gadgets and material that he put into his home. Next was government buildings on Fort Lewis. Next was new apartment complexes, and so on and on. Now, this builder who I was friends with was not my day-to-day boss while insulating. It was his son, who is younger than I and a bit of a jerk. But we got along fine and all seemed well. The father owned the insulation company, but had very little to do with it on a day-to-day basis. I hardly saw him for 3 months. Now, being a contractor myself, I was used to not getting paychecks every 2 weeks like most working folks. I would get paid once a month for my maintenance accounts for the previous month of service, and it didn't all come in at once. Sometimes people forget to pay on time. My crew, though, was used to getting paid in a timely manner, and after the first month of work and receiving no check from my new boss, I inquired when to expect a check. He assured me that once the check started rolling in, that we would see our money. I totally get how that works, especially for a new company trying to get off the ground. So I paid my guys to keep the peace on my end, and my boss and I worked out an agreement that I would keep track of everything paid and that he would cut me a check once he was able to. I also had an outstanding landscape invoice out with the father of over $10,000 that I wasn't really worried about because he was not always super quick about payment. Not that I had to hound him about it, but you understand. Now, we are at the end of February 2009, and it was time to gear up for the new season of landscape maintenance and put my crew back to work outside. Still no payment from insulation or the last landscape project. Things got ugly real fast as I started daily phone calls to the son now that we didn't see each other as often. I called the father, who more or less ignored me. The son stopped answering my calls and texts, and the father never had a straight answer for me. Now, mid-April of 2009, most communication has stopped on their end. I filed a contractor's lien on the landscape project to be paid out before the house sold, which prompted a call from the father to invite me to his home for lunch and talk. I accepted, thinking he was going to offer me a deal of some kind based on my past history with him. He basically told me that he had been over the years screwed out of money by different people and that it was something that I was going to have to learn to live with. My response: well, I've been screwed out of money that people owe me as well, just not by anyone I considered a friend. I left his house, determined to stick it to him. May 5th, 2009, I started a spray foam insulation company with the same level of equipment that he had, but about a year less experience than he had. May 7th, I get a call from the father asking a landscape question, acting as if we were on normal terms. My response was, "Oh, I don't landscape anymore, I spray foam." "What are you talking about?" he asked. When I explained to him that I was operating a spray foam insulation company, he ended the phone call rather quickly. I then receive a phone call from his son 5 minutes later, who had ignored my calls for the last many weeks, threatening me that he would destroy my hopes of making it as an insulator and that no little landscaper could or would make it in this community. Side note, with my newly formed company, there was now approximately 4 to 5 companies in the Pacific Northwest performing this kind of service. It's a small circle of people in the insulation world, and the word gets around pretty quick who does what and so on. Our very first job was handed to us by our material supplier, which happened to be his supplier, and that job was a fix. Apparently, that very first job we'd worked on, that plastic surgeon's house, was insulated incorrectly and poor workmanship. Luckily, my only involvement on that house was prep work and cleanup. We ended up remodeling all of the insulation and reinstalling it. About a $65,000 job, which the owner of the house turned around and sued my old boss for and won. We then acquired the government contract at Fort Lewis that he had because of poor communication on his part. Anyway, we systematically took apart his company by being better and honest with people. The story spread in the spray foam insulation world, and we became somewhat hero-like in this region because they had screwed so many people over. Oh, and at that time, if you might remember, the housing market took a giant dump, and guess who had 4 very large houses sitting out there that couldn't sell? Yup, the father, who ended up going bankrupt by mid-09. The son, on the other hand, kept his head above water somehow a bit longer. But in October of 09, I got a call from a repo man asking if I knew the son and where to find his spray foam equipment. My father-in-law happened to be a retired cop and PI, and I put him on the case to find said equipment. 2 days later, he called with the address and specific location of the equipment, which was behind a barn on an island with the tires aired down. I made the call to the repo man, and 2 hours later, he called me from his lot as he was pulling in with a very large trailer behind his truck, asking where he could send the bounty check. I kept the insulation business for about 3 years before being bought out by another company. I also kept the landscape company and still run it to this day. Moral of the story, landscapers may work in the dirt and seem simple, but tick one off and they will ruin you. Kinda my revenge, kinda my sister's. Both of us really proud. This is going to be long, so TLDR at the bottom. Here's our cast. My sister, we'll call her Sarah for the story. Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Paul. Ex-boyfriend's new wife, Jane. Ex-boyfriend's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe. And oldest brother, Zeke. Our parents and me. When I was 14, my oldest sister, Sarah, was 22, we found out that she was pregnant with Paul, her boyfriend of 4 years. They immediately got engaged and they were really happy. For a time. Sarah had a horrible pregnancy. About 16 to 18 weeks in the wonder of creating a human life evaporated within her. She developed hyperemesis, which, if you don't know, is really bad morning sickness. She was constantly in pain. She developed gestational diabetes and just all around hated the experience. Around this time, Paul, the then fiance, started getting sick of the complaining. I believe his argument was, "Your body is built to do this, it can't be that bad." Sarah was due around Valentine's Day, and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were very excited, both about the grandkid and the fact that he could be born on a holiday. She was very against that and really hoped that her son wouldn't be born on a holiday, even one as small as Valentine's Day. See, her birthday falls sometimes on Easter, and she hates it, because it might make him feel that his day isn't very much about him. Well, Mrs. Doe says something like, "Well, if you name him Valentine or Valentino, then that'll make the day even more special to him." Again, my sister hated the idea. She thought it was tacky, he'd be bullied for it, and just really didn't like the name Valentino. Paul loved it, but agreed to go with a more average name like Daniel or Jared. Fast forward to February, and she was ready to get this over with. Sarah had officially been put on bed rest because while standing or walking, her blood pressure took unexpected spikes and dips. I look back now and goodness do I feel bad for her. She was doing her best to avoid giving birth on Valentine's Day because, again, she didn't want him born on a holiday. Unfortunately, births happen when they happen, and that baby was going to come on Valentine's Day whether she wanted him to or not. I remember waiting out in the waiting room with my dad, brothers, and Paul, who couldn't stand to be in the delivery room because it was gross. I was so mad that he could have gone in but wouldn't because he thought my sister was gross while giving birth, whereas I had to stay outside because I was too young to go in with my mom and other sister. Dad went home with the youngest two brothers while the oldest, Zeke, stayed to watch me because I refused to leave. 16 hours after Sarah went into labor, my little nephew was officially part of the family on the evening of Valentine's Day. Unfortunately, Sarah was not okay. She had to have an emergency cesarean section, and while doing the operation, discovered that the back of her uterus, facing the spinal cord, had a very large and very severe, thankfully non-cancerous, tumor. When I say large, I mean it was twice the size of a standard uterus. The doctors were shocked and didn't understand why nobody had noticed it on an ultrasound. It accounted for her severe back pain and blood pressure issues. The doctors immediately went in for more surgery to remove the tumor, but sadly ended up having to perform a full hysterectomy. This meant that my nephew would be Sarah's only child. Now, while Sarah was in for surgery, Paul was taking care of everything baby-related to make sure his son was okay. In my 14-year-old self's memory, I remember him being suitably distraught, but I didn't really pay him much mind and spent my time in the waiting room with my mother and other sister. Zeke, however, wanted to be a good future brother-in-law and make sure that Paul was okay. He found Paul filling out the baby paperwork on his own, looking, in my brother's words, like he had not a single worry in his mind. Zeke asked why Paul didn't wait for Sarah to fill out the paperwork, as she should have been put out of surgery within the hour, and Paul said that he just wanted her to get her rest and heal. That checked out with Zeke, as he was 16 and didn't know any better at the time. Now, I know you're probably thinking, no he wouldn't, he knows how much she hates that name, and still, she'd need to sign the paperwork too. My fellow peoples of Reddit, I regret to inform you that Paul forged Sarah's signature on the paperwork and waited until she was out of surgery to hand said paperwork over. My sweet nephew that was born on Valentine's Day was named Valentino on his first official birth certificate. I still to this day don't know why Paul and his family were so insistent about the name. He had even picked out a different one with my sister. And before you ask, no, he was never brought up on forgery charges because his parents were witnesses to her signing the papers, even though they only got there at the last minute. So, Sarah dumped him and got her son's name changed a month later. She was willing to do split custody with him because that's her son's father and she wants the kid to know him. But Paul vanished and she never heard anything back, which seemed weirdly out of character to us. Until a mutual friend on Facebook was tagged in his wedding picture 6 months later. Paul had apparently started cheating on her not long after she got pregnant. Sarah was livid, but there wasn't much she could do, so she filed for child support and continued to live her best life. Until 6 years later. This is where the revenge starts, my friends. So, Sarah has been a single mother for the past 6 years and has been amazing at it. At this point in my career, I've been a hairdresser for about 8 months at our local Great Clips. I'm working one day, and who is seated before me but Jane, Paul's wife, herself. I take her back for a trim, and she clearly has no idea who I am. That adds up because a mutual friend that still keeps in contact with Paul said that Jane doesn't know a thing. She has no idea about Sarah, that she was the other woman, or that Paul actually has a kid that he's been, infrequently, paying child support for. She's in the dark on it all. I told myself not to be a butt and treat her like a normal customer, which I did. Now, at this point, Jane was heavily pregnant, so a lot of our conversation was about that. She loved being pregnant, but it was hard. Her husband was so unsympathetic, big shocker, and she was due in 10 weeks and they still hadn't picked out a name for their baby girl. Ladies and gentle peoples, this was my chance. I asked what kind of name she was looking for, and she said, I want something unique and unusual, but not ridiculous like Brant Lely. You know the ones I'm talking about. And Paul had suggested so many already, and she didn't like any of them. So I, the conniving little weasel I am, said, what about Sarah? My sister's name isn't actually Sarah. She was named after an older family member that passed not long after she was born, but there was no female equivalent for his name, so our parents just created one. It's a beautiful name, and it's just what Jane was looking for. She loved it. She stuck by it, and I found out by stalking her Facebook months later that she had put her foot down about it, and that was their daughter's name. Now Paul has a daughter with his ex's name to remind him every day about her, and also to remind him to pay his freaking child support. Little nephew is 10 years old now with a new name and no contact with his biological father, though we do sometimes still call him Val as a family nickname. He likes it, but doesn't want to bring it to school, so it's staying a family nickname. Sarah pretends to hate when we call him that in a joking way. As long as he likes it, she doesn't have a problem with it. And she's seeing a new guy who's really great and like a father to Val. HOA Karen demands what I do on my property, but I'm not even in the HOA. Click the video on your screen so you don't miss the crazy fallout of this one, and I'll see you there.